Hi, friends. This is John. Welcome to the Regenerative Agriculture Podcast, where we have all kinds of fun conversations related to regenerating soil, landscapes, and human health, and everything that connects the dots between those. I've been looking forward to the conversation today for quite some time. I have with me Ian Gould from Oakbank Game in the UK, and Ian has been doing some fascinating work with cover crops and with ecological restoration from a slightly different perspective than the one we commonly are exposed to here in the US and here in North America. And so, Ian, thank you for being willing to be here today. You know, there are so many things for us to talk about. I'm hoping to get into some of these conversations. Over the last several months, I've been studying and I've been thinking about plants and seeds as microbial inoculants, seeds as vectors of a microbiome. And from this perspective, what we've been learning from Christine Jones and from James White and others is that rather than thinking about individual varieties, we should, or perhaps even individual species, we should be thinking in terms of plant families. But you've had some experiences that actually go in the other direction of that describe how individual varieties can be very unique from each other in the way that they show up in an ecosystem. So I want to get into some of that conversation, but why don't you give us some context for the scope of your work? What has been your journey over the last couple of decades, and what's the scope of the things that you're working on today?
So the thing that really set me off on sort of this journey that I've been on around regenerative agriculture and using plants to solve problems in agriculture was completely my visit to the first groundswell show that happened I think it's about 10 years ago. And now, when you think the scale that it's got to now, where there's sort of 8,000 visitors over 2 days, back then it was about 300 people in one barn. And my first job in agriculture was involved in plant breeding of new cereal varieties at what was the old Plant Breeding Institute. And it was sort of opened up my mind to the possibility of some of the things we'd learned doing habitat creation in terms of using teams of plants together to deliver different benefits could also maybe be used in this space. And the work that people like Gabe Brown and Alan Williams, and particularly I think they were following the work of Ademir Cagliari from Brazil on multi-species cover crops. It really was a fascination. And so anyway, I went away from there, and we've been an exhibitor at Groundswell ever since that first year, and it's been a fantastic community of people that from all over the world that have visited and also connected. And then it's kind of also created an interest from myself to go to events like No-Till on the Plains and the Acres Conference in the States, which is where I met you, both of those events for the first time. The community now and the ability to speak to people online from all over the world has really opened up, and this whole regenerative community is such an open sharing place that you might have had an idea that someone else has been doing, or you're listening to people. So I actively speak to people in the US, in Australia, New Zealand, Denmark, all over Europe, pretty regularly, finding out what's going on and feeding back and that kind of thing. So the knowledge exchange is hugely valuable, and I think it'll help people get better faster, which is the most important part, because we really don't have time. I was at an event in Amsterdam a couple of weeks ago, and it felt like Groundhog Day from 12 months ago at the same event. Like, it felt like no progress had been made. It's like all these big companies still talking about piloting things. We don't have time to keep piloting stuff when we know the fundamentals of what needs to be done. We just need to get it done at scale. And, unquestionably, money is what will drive that change. But
Yeah, Ian, you described your beginnings, your shift into the agricultural space, and your background in seed breeding. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, and also bring us forward to what is the scope of the work that you are doing today? You started with game lands, but you're doing work today that is very different or much broader than that.
initially, a lot of our work was confined to the perimeter of the field, the edges of the field, or the non-productive areas of the farms, because that's where the farmer could get money from the government to compensate them from taking the land out of production. And this kind of goes on from, it's something that I want to sort of discuss a bit later, maybe, which is if you're trying to incentivize something, make sure you're incentivizing the thing you really want. And so initially our work was, strips around the edges of fields, in the corners of fields, that sort of thing. But now it's very much broad acre, looking at soil health. So some of the options in the countryside stewardship and what's called the environmental land management scheme is looking at soil health on a wider scale. So farmers are now being incentivized to use multi-species herb-rich grass lays instead of just ryegrass pasture for their cattle and sheep. They're being offered money to grow legume fallow crops. So instead of growing what they found to be unprofitable break crops, they're using the option to grow a largely legume-based mix to avoid putting more inputs on the soil and to start trying to rebuild the soil health. But some of that stuff that you were talking with Rick Clark from Christine about legumes not being entirely positive was very interesting. So there's all of those things. So now we've gone from the edges of the fields, from the extremities, right into the middle and the heart of the agricultural production system, and looking at how plants can be used to improve productivity as well as environmental delivery.
One of the pieces that I found interesting in having conversations and just observing conversations as well with growers from the UK is that there seems to be a lot more. There's a lot of innovation happening in the U.S. in terms of relay cropping and intercropping and so forth. But one of the things that I don't see happening here as much is a combination of varieties of the same species, planting 5 wheat varieties together, for example. What have you been observing and experiencing with the combination of different varieties?
Let's talk about the pros and the cons of this. So the idea of doing that is to increase the diversity of both yield and quality potential amongst those different varieties, but mainly to extend the range of disease resistance and pest resistance, so that if you got particularly fungal diseases, if you had some species in there that were highly resistant to those diseases, the ability of that disease to spread across the whole crop would be reduced. And that certainly has been seen. But equally, when you do the numbers, there's no doubt at all that in a standard, typical agricultural production system, the application of a fungicide is one of the highest returns on investment you'll get in a disease year. Like we've just had a really wet winter and a wet spring and cold spring. So if you didn't get your disease control right, and I mean that in a chemical way, it costs you a lot of money. There's no doubt about that. Now, it could well be said that if you start to go down this regenerative path and you start to build your soil health and you start to get your nutritional balance in the soil better, that the thing I know you believe in, that you can, with nutrition, you can make plants resistant to these things without the use of fungicides and pesticides. And I'm sure there's a lot of truth in that, but you have to deal with people where they are. And at the moment they're in a situation where if they didn't use Septoria fungicide in the UK this year, it was really bad news. But going on to the positives, we've done some work, and my company is part of a group called Velcourt Group, and they're very large scale farmers in the UK. They farm about 55,000 hectares in the UK, across the whole country, from the southwest to the northeast and up into Scotland, on a huge range of soil types and farm types and so on. And we farm other people's land for them. So we're all about delivering on whatever the objectives are for the landowner. And I know in the work there they've done where they trialed mixtures of 4 different wheat varieties in a field, and the results have been quite widely spread in terms of the results. But in general, there was absolutely a measurable yield increase on average when nothing else changed. So the only change in that was the mix of varieties as opposed to growing the individual varieties on their own.
Do you have any hypothesis about why that might contribute a yield response? I mean, you would my first reaction is, well, this is the same plant species. They're competing with each other for water and nutrients and so forth at the exact same stage of development. So why a yield response?
Yeah, well, it is possible that the different varieties are going through slightly different maturities and things in their growth cycle at slightly different times. There clearly are some differences, although they're very marginal. Whether they would be significant or not, I'm not sure. But in a population variety of one, everything is competing for the same thing at the same time. Everything is. So whether that's part of it, I don't know. Whether there's some degree of uh, the different plants helping and affecting the impact of diseases and pests in that population, we'll have to wait and see. But as I say, the range was quite wide, but on average there was a significant yield increase from simply using a blend. Now the problem is, from a practical point of view, that there's also quite a significant cost to the seed provider in order to provide the seed blends to the farmer, because we have, I don't know what you call it in the US, but we have a thing called seed certification, which is where seed has to be produced to certain quality standards and disease standards and that kind of thing. The only way to certify seed is an individual variety, one at a time. So that process has to be done, and then it's like an aftermarket thing, which is to mix the varieties together. So it's a time and cost thing, which obviously costs the grower money. Now, a number of farmers I know here who are members of, there's an organisation called Base UK, which is a sort of regenerative farming, no-till farming group, and a lot of those farmers are now producing their own seed on their own farms and cleaning them up on the farm. So they're actually growing these blends and harvesting the blends and using them that way. And we can go into the benefits of having your seed and this hollow bionts and all this sort of thing on the seed from your soil and making it more adaptable to your particular environment. But initially, they're largely trying to save money by producing their own seed and doing it that way. So there is some resistance from the seed trades to do this, because it is quite a lot of extra work at a very busy time of year, and it does make the whole thing more expensive. But in our experience, there is some benefit to be gained from it.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question to explore, is to attempt to understand why we are observing a yield response. It's another one of those cases where 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2, which is intriguing. So I immediately jumped to this conversation around wheat and combinations of various varieties, but tell us a little bit about some of the things that you've been doing with cover crops and with various plant species in the field, in addition to just in the hedgerows and on the field edge.
If we go on from combinations of species in terms of crops being harvested together, in the in the circles that I sort of tend to spend my time in the UK, we're sort of talking to people like Andy Howard, who I believe you know, who did a Nuffield scholarship in around bicropping, intercropping, companion cropping, that sort of thing. So I've been very interested in what he's doing, where he's growing crops actually together in a similar way to some of the people like Jason Mork in the US is doing. And that's to impart more diversity in the field, but also perhaps with things like growing peas and oats together, the peas are held up by the oats, and actually it seems that the oats help with some of the weed control as well, because peas are quite a sparse crop at times, and it allows space for weeds to grow. So if you put something into that space, it can certainly appears to help with some of the weed ingress, and it certainly can help also with holding the peas up off the ground, making them easier to harvest. Clearly, then you've probably got a cost of separating them, but separating a nice round product with a long straight product is pretty straightforward and fairly easy. And that's not proving to be a huge challenge to people here. Other things, oats and beans, have been quite successful. We're trying in amongst the ELM scheme. So there's a scheme in England now called the Sustainable Farming Incentive, and farmers are able to access £55 a hectare to grow companion crops in their other crops. Now, a companion in our terminology is generally something that provides a service to the cash crop or to the wider environment, to the soil and so on, but it doesn't go to harvest. So it's something that's either killed by the frost or is killed by herbicide later on, but it's there to help the crop maybe get established or provide some other service. So the species that most of that was done initially was with oilseed rape, or canola, as I believe you call it. So we have a particularly bad problem here with a pest called cabbage stem flea beetle, which is potentially completely devastating to crops at that emergence time. And there was some work, I believe initially it came out of France, where they were using other crops with the oilseed rape at establishment to disguise the rape, both physically with physical hiding the plants, and also chemically through smell, because the theory was that the flea beetle found the fields through a mixture of colour and smell. I don't know where the evidence for that came from, but that was certainly the feedback we had. So we were using species, and continue to, like buckwheat, which grows extremely quickly. It germinates when it's quite dry, which is really helpful at that time of year, and it generally gets growing faster and above the crop, and it physically hides the rape plant, so the crop doesn't look like a rape crop. We also use species like berseem or Egyptian clover, which roots very quickly, and the rape roots seem to follow those roots down and get established better. And also we're using fenugreek, which we know as the curry plant, to provide that chemical smell. Emits a smell to the environment, and that seems to disguise that. So whilst in no way do I think this is a magic bullet that solves the problem by itself, I think in combination with things like nutrition, timing of planting, long stubble, which I think also helps, it does seem to be providing a benefit. And the government here have recognised this opportunity, and they are basically taking the risk away from the farmer. So the £55 more than pays for the cost of the seed and doing the job. So I think a lot of people are trying that. And now we're also trying companion cropping with other crops like wheat, for example, where in hard sort of economic terms, £55 doesn't cover very much yield loss. So if you thought using a companion was going to have a negative impact on yield, because you couldn't use a robust herbicide program, for example, because we do have big problems with grass weeds in particular. But we found a couple of species, which are beans and linseed, which allow the farmer to use a typical herbicide program on their crop and still keep those plants alive and doing what they do. So beans are obviously doing something for fixing nitrogen and helping biology. And linseed, I found personally, linseed's a wonderful crop for improving soil structure. It's got really deep vertical roots, and we find a lot of worms in fields where we've put linseed in the past, or flax. I don't think, is that your experience too, John?
Yeah, we also see a lot of positives from flax as well. But I want to make sure I'm understanding it correctly. Are you using the beans and the flax as a companion crop with the wheat?
Yes, we are. Exactly that.
Okay, let's tell us a little bit more about that. What types of application rates or seeding rates are you using, and what is the timing, seeding timing, and so forth? Are they being planted at the same time as the wheat?
Yes, so this is part of the challenge, and it's certainly something that we're learning quite a bit about as we go along. And actually, vetches are another species that we've tried which have worked quite effectively. So if we start with beans, obviously the bigger challenge to plant beans and wheat is the relative seed size is enormously different. So um, there are a number of ways around that. The first is to plant wheat into a field that has previously had beans in it. So there's a lot of volunteer beans, and instead of doing what farmers have done for years, which is make them germinate and spray them off and kill them, we simply don't kill them. We leave them where they are. So there's a fairly large population of what we call volunteer beans that you then plant the wheat into, and that would be a perfectly acceptable way of doing it. Um, there are some drills now that have multiple hoppers, and they can perhaps put beans down one set of coulters at one depth and the wheat at another. But a lot of people have found that they need to basically do two processes. One is to plant the beans, and then you plant the wheat over the top. Now, as soon as you start doing that, £55 a hectare doesn't go very far. So you have to believe that there's some other value from doing it, which clearly I do believe that, and I'm sure you would as well. But um, at the moment, that sort of level of confidence that there's a value, um, people need to see evidence of that, and I understand that completely, and that's perfectly reasonable.
So what are the evidences that you've observed of beans and flax and vetch that give you confidence that this is something worthwhile exploring?
Well, clearly, getting some more diversity into the field is good from a soil biology point of view. The beans can generate some serious quantities of nitrogen from the fixation by the rhizobia. So that would hopefully mean that at some point the amount of nitrogen that had to be applied would be reduced. So there'd be a cost saving and a sort of soil toxicity saving, if you like, from that, plus all the benefits to the carbon footprint of the crop, which is something that a lot of people are looking at very hard. Um, in terms of linseed, I find that just really helps with soil structuring. So one of the things I've been trying to look at is have a companion in the mix that roots quite differently from your cash crop. So it's accessing nutrient and water, particularly from a different place to where your cash crop is. Otherwise, it can be quite competitive. So I'll give you another example. We've been using small leaved white clover as an understory. And what we're trying to do with that is leave it there for a number of years. So it's like a permanent perennial understory in the crop into which you plant your cash crop. Now, the difficulty with clover is that um, different sorts of clover behave very differently. So the reason we've chosen to work extensively with the small leaf one is the plant doesn't get very big. So it doesn't become a problem in the crop canopy. It doesn't become a problem at combining time. It stays relatively low in the base of the crop. Um, that has two downsides to it. One is that after harvest, a lot of people like to turn sheep out onto these fields to graze the clover down. And with the small leaf clover, you trade off less problematic issues with the harvested crop for lower volume of forage. And equally, the smaller crop fixes much less nitrogen than maybe a big crop of red clover would. So very often when I'm talking to people about this, they've read that a clover field could fix 300 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, for example. Well, I'm not doubting that's possible with a big forage clover, which is 2 feet tall and very lush and whatever. But a small leaf clover, which was frankly it was designed in an amenity setting, so for things like lawn grasses and golf courses and that sort of thing, it doesn't do that. But what it does do is it does cover the ground really effectively. And again, the issue could be that the rooting of that crop is is too similar to wheat as the cash crop. So is it causing competitiveness with the cash crop compared to something else? So there's a chap who, I don't know if you've spoken to him or met him, called Frederick Larsen from Denmark.
Yep.
I
Oh
think
yeah.
I think I might have introduced you to him. Anyway, he's doing some work with lucerne in the same sense, and I have to be honest, when I heard he was doing it, I thought he was completely mad. Because we used to use lucerne and triticale as an environmental crop, so we never had to worry about combining it. But lucerne has the capacity to grow enormously, and I just thought, if you were going wheat to combine at some point, having lucerne in there would be a nightmare.
For all of our North American people, lucerne is otherwise known as alfalfa.
Alfalfa,
Yeah.
yeah, alfalfa. So I thought he was nuts and was causing problem for himself. But Frederick's come up with, and Frederick's a farmer and an agronomist, and he's a really, really good guy. Find him on Twitter. He's a
Yep.
very, very interesting guy to follow. And he comes up with the concept of what he calls chemical mowing. So he uses herbicide to suppress the lucerne at key stages, so that then what he's able to do is combine. Basically, he combines the heads of wheat off the straw. So he combines quite high, and he takes the wheat off, and he doesn't seem to have any problem with lucerne getting in the tank or being a problem in his wheat sample. He then goes along and he mows the straw and whatever's left of the lucerne really tight to the ground immediately after harvest. And then his lucerne crop grows like mad, and he gets a forage crop off it after he's had his wheat off. So it's an incredibly productive system, and it seems to be working really well. But he has a specific variety of lucerne that goes to sleep early in the autumn, so it doesn't challenge the wheat when it's getting established, and it wakes up late in the spring,
Yeah.
so that it's as uncompetitive with the wheat as possible. And the other factor that's really important is lucerne has a really long taproot, so it's extracting nutrients from a depth below which the wheat doesn't go. So it's not competing in the same place for water and nutrient. And I think that has got some really interesting potential, but we haven't managed to get hold of the right varieties of lucerne yet.
Ian, I have about a dozen different questions I want to follow up on based on the various things you've been talking about. But I think your ending note here is so important, is that when thinking about cover crops and companion crops, it's so easy for us to just, at least maybe I should just speak for myself. It's easy for me to just think that, oh, well, alfalfa is alfalfa from a cover crop perspective, or that flax is flax, and not give enough consideration to the fact that specific varieties of these companion plants have a tremendous influence on the outcomes of whether it's successful or not. So I wanted to ask you about, oh my goodness, so many different things, but we're on the alfalfa and the wheat for right now. So let's start there, and then I'm going to go back through some of these pieces you've been talking about. But you mentioned that these Frederick systems are very productive, and I do want to have a conversation with him here at some point. But what does the productivity look like? Obviously, I can imagine you're now getting a double crop. You're getting both a forage harvest and you're getting a grain harvest. But what have the yields been looking like on the grain harvest specifically? Are they similar to what they are without the alfalfa? Better? Less? What does that look like?
I think at the moment they're similar. I wouldn't like to say they were better, and I don't think they're particularly hampered by the lucerne. Um, I think it's very important to remember that in the early stages of learning about how this works, there will probably be some very catastrophic results at times, and we've seen it ourselves with working with cover crops and planting planting green into cover crops and so on and so forth. We've had some real testing situations where the error that we made has cost 2 to 3 tons a hectare of cereal grain. Now, that's not, that doesn't mean that's going to be normal. it was a learning point. We know why that happened. We learned from it. We're not going to do that again. But it was a very real result. And I think you have to be completely honest about, where you've been, because you learn so much more from your mistakes than from your great successes, really. And the thing that I really sort of suggest people do is they try not to be too greedy with the the number of benefits they want to get from something that they're trying, which is a bit different. So if we take the clover, for example, if you were to try and be greedy and use a clover that delivered more nitrogen and more forage, you might well cost yourself money in the wheat yield, because it would be probably more competitive with the wheat. And if you lost a ton of wheat, that would cost you perhaps £200, because that's the value of the ton of wheat you could have had. Now, is the forage that you're producing, is that worth £200 net? Probably not. So some of these things are incremental gains, and we just have to be sort of kind on ourselves and those people who are doing this, to say, look, we really don't have all the answers. We've got to try this out. But in agriculture, if you take all the learning from 1 year's experience, you're an absolute fool. Because we've seen it here this year with some of the work one of my most interesting clients is doing with foliar nitrogen. He did some experiments last year in conjunction with Joel Williams, who's a really good guy that I know well. He did some experiments, and on the farm there, that the farm standard was 200 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, and he did an experiment which was a total of 140 kilos, some of which was foliar, and it proved to be no different to the 200 kilos of normal nitrogen that he'd used previously. But last year compared to this year was totally different weather-wise, and this year, when he turned the whole farm basically around to the new way of doing things, we had a very wet winter. The crop establishment was very different. The amount of leaf area at certain times was very different. The potential to get nutrition into a crop when it needed it was very different through the leaves, I mean. So actually, it turned out to be quite an expensive mistake to do it this year, but you can understand completely why, on the basis of the information gained, you would do it. But it's proven to be an expensive mistake. So what we'd like to try and find out is, at what stage can we make the decision to use less liquid nitrogen and more foliar nitrogen? And how late can you make that decision? Because it seems if you don't make the decision to put on the soil-based nutrition early enough, you can never catch up with the foliar. And personally, I think the most useful thing to farmers at the minute would actually be really, really good weather data, or predictive weather data, because if you knew what the weather was going to do even a few weeks ahead, and you could reliably use it, you'd probably make those decisions a lot easier. But it seems to me, with the way the weather's behaving, the weather data is actually getting less accurate, not more accurate. So that was really just an example of where you tried something out. It looks absolutely a no-brainer to make the change, but then the environment, because we're not under a roof, or we're not in a glass house, the environment completely changed the way that the thing behaved in another season.
Let's come back to wheat and companion planting of beans and flax.
Yeah.
And you mentioned vetch as well. When you mentioned that sometimes that you need to go through and plant the beans first and then come back and plant the wheat after that, when you were taking that approach, what seeding rate are you using for the beans? And also, what plant populations are you targeting for the flax and the vetch?
Okay, so we need to differentiate when you're using this as a crop that is not going to be taken to harvest, compared to where you are going to do a bycrop. So, for example, the oats and the beans grown together and harvested together. So where you're using it only as a companion plant, my suggestion to people, and this is definitely an area of development work that we're not sure we've got the right answer, but we've been targeting sort of 15% to 20% of a typical normal seeding rate. So with linseed, for example, people would typically plant, 25 kilos or something like that. So we've been using about 6 or 7 kilos of linseed in amongst the wheat. And then with beans, anything, because beans vary in size. So we use the same term, 1,000 grain weight, 1,000 seed weight.
Yep.
So the 1,000 seed weight of beans varies enormously from 250 to 700, depending on whether you're using a small spring tick bean, as we call them, right up to a winter fava bean, like a horse bean or something. So you need to be pretty careful that you're talking about the right sort of thing. But the range would probably vary from 20 kilos of a smaller bean right up to sort of 50 kilos of a bigger one. And that seems to be looking about right. And so with vetches, you'd probably be looking at 6 kilos a hectare, something like that. So because they're relatively small. And the advantage of vetch, well, there's two main ones. One is they also allow the same herbicide use that beans allow, and physically they're much easier to deal with a drill, and can be planted at the same time. The difficulty farmers in England are having is what a lot of them do is they delayed sowing the wheat until the middle of October to try and get some emergence of some of their problematic grass weeds, and then they would use glyphosate to kill them off before planting. But if you're waiting until mid-October to plant this stuff, that's quite late. Well, no, it's too late to be planting linseed and vetches, and have them be successful and meaningfully useful. So you really need to be drilling mid-September into late September for those two species to be successful. Beans will certainly tolerate a much later sowing date.
So for all of our North American listeners, you can figure out the more precise math, but when Ian is speaking about kilos per hectare, it's a rough equivalent to pounds per acre. There's
more or less, not quite, but nearly. Yeah.
This is still an area, as I understand it, that you're still experimenting with. But what type of yield response and grain response do you expect to see in the wheat when you do these companion plantings?
To be honest, we're not expecting to see a yield response particularly. We're almost trying to avoid a yield loss. That would be the honest thing. So these tools, I think, have more benefits down the line than in the year of harvest. We're just trying to get more diversity into the system, reduce the amount of inputs we need to put in, that sort of thing. I wouldn't say at this point, in terms of an annual return, that we're really looking for a yield increase. We're definitely trying to avoid a yield loss at this point.
Got it. All right. Well, I think there's some interesting conversations to be had about, can we identify other species that also have a collaborative relationship? And of course, the herbicide control is an interesting conundrum or confounding factor that we have to take into consideration.
Yeah.
But I haven't lost sight of, I'm guessing there's probably a few listeners who are fascinated by your conversation around the cabbage stem flea beetle and rapeseed and canola. And I haven't lost sight of that. I want to come back to that conversation as well. You mentioned the inclusion of fenugreek, and you're probably the second or third place that or individual that I've heard speaking about the inclusion of fenugreek to mask the odor of the brassica and its attractiveness. And I guess let's talk a little bit more about what are the seeding rates that you're using for these various crops, and also what is your degree of success?
I'm always very careful not to sort of fly the flag for one specific thing delivering a specific result when I haven't got real evidence that that's what's happened. So I know people who've tried to grow just fenugreek as their companion crop in oilseed rape to see what happens. And I'll be honest, I don't think they've had particularly great success with it. But in terms of this kind of combination of physical masking with the buckwheat and chemical masking with the fenugreek, we tend to package it up with other things like nutrition and other bits and pieces. So it would be very hard to say that one specific thing had got things over the line. I don't. You're probably not familiar with the guy. His name is Sir David Brailsford, and he was in charge of the British cycling team at the Olympics, and he came up with this concept of marginal gains, which is, if you add 1% here and 1% there and 1% there and 1% there, actually you end up with quite a significant improvement. And you look at the difference between the person finishing first and second in a race, which lasts 20 minutes, and they finish 2 seconds apart. That 1% can make a difference. So with oilseed rape growing, I try and sort of get people to look at a whole range of things together, and the sum of the parts seems to be what gets the thing through and make a successful crop. And ultimately, that's what we're all after, because I mean, we're doing some work with a company here measuring soil carbon improvements, so soil organic carbon in the soil. And the biggest negative is where people have failed to get a crop. So not having living roots in the soil, not having soil cover, that kind of thing is hugely damaging. And if that means you need to do something that on the face of it you would rather not do, like cultivation, for example, if the cultivation is really required to get the plants to be successful, then you should absolutely do it. I'd love to be really evangelical about no-till farming, but if you're on a heavy clay that isn't in a position yet, it hasn't got to that point where it can self-sustain itself, being too evangelical about I'm absolutely never going to move the soil again, I'm only going to don't no-till, it probably will cost you a lot of money. You might well get where you wanted to go, but whether you survived as a business through that process is a completely different conversation. So all of these things are coming back to the companion crop. I just think it's an incremental gain, but where people are doing these things together, they are largely getting success. So one of the other things here is I don't know whether you have the same product, but we have the anaerobic digesters, the biodigesters, and they have this product we call Digestate that comes out, and it's used as a biofertilizer and soil improver. I found where that has been applied before growing oilseed rape, that's been a real positive. Now, is that just nutrition? Is it the smell? Because it's quite smelly old stuff. Which part of the thing that's delivering is giving this benefit? But where we've used digestate and we've used companion crops and we've left the tall stubble, my logic for the tall stubble is as follows. When you go out in the autumn here, on a sort of dewy morning where there's dew on the crops, you see a tall stubble field have this enormous spider's web concoction across the whole field. Now, I'm sure that's really bad news for flea beetle, having, I'm just sure it is.
Yeah.
And it's part of the not using insecticides. So this whole bio armory of tools that we've got is building up the positives, it's building up the nutrition, it's building up the soil health, and it's also, it's trying to avoid things which I think actually take you backwards at times. So I'm not sure I really answered your question, but I don't have hard and fast, A plus B equals C numbers on fenugreek. I don't have it, but as I say, we're just using it collectively with other tools, and we're getting good results, and cost-effective results too.
So you mentioned the layering of these various one percenters, tall grain stems, this combination of buckwheat and fenugreek. And it seems to me that earlier you had mentioned another plant that you're including as a companion as well. Was it only buckwheat and fenugreek, or is there something else that you're including as well?
But Berseem clover or Egyptian clover, yeah, that's a very fast growing annual clover. and it seems to root really quickly. And the theory is that the oilseed rape plant roots follow those roots down, so it helps them get established in sort of impaired soil conditions a little bit. We use a particular, again, we're going back to this variety specific thing. We use a particular variety or a particular type of Berseem clover it's called a single cut. So there are two types. There's a single cut and multi-cut. So multi-cut, you can cut for hay and it will grow back again. Single cut, you can cut it once and it dies. Now that cutting can be done by physical means or it can be done by frost. So what we find with this one is it dies in a frost very reliably, and then it's gone. And so it just reduces the amount of herbicide that you need to control. And it also seems to grow very, 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 very quickly. So we like it from that point of view as well. Whereas I know people who've had, they've used multi-cut Berseem clover, and if they haven't been able to get on, like this winter's been so wet that they perhaps weren't able to get on and control it with the planned herbicide program, it can become a problem. But it's relatively easy to control with various chemicals. But I know one or two agronomists have had some problems where they've used a variety that didn't die in the winter. And in this country, unlike the US, we do not have reliable frosts at the right time. So as much as we would love to use nature's tools to kill things off or do what they do, with the way the climate is changing, we can't reliably wait on those things. That's always a concern. And we also don't have the tool of GMO either here at the moment, which I know a lot of people, they're seeing companion crops and so on in, for example, in between rows of maize. But you've got GMO maize that gets sprayed with glyphosate early on, and then they can plant very comfortably in between the rows of maize. We use very different products which are quite residual and have a long-lasting legacy effect. So we struggle to do those particular things here. So that's why in amongst maize for soil protection things, largely people are just using grass because they're not affected by the same broadleaf weed herbicides that we would have to use compared to you being able to use Roundup.
Yeah, so I want to also come back. You mentioned one of the things that you're layering in for the flea beetles is nutrition. And I want to come back and talk a bit about nutrition. But before we do that, we've now had this, you've mentioned already, I think, 3 or 4 specific instances of where you're selecting specific cover crop varieties to do specific things. You spoke about Frederick's work with a specific lucerne variety, a specific Berseem clover variety. What are other examples of companions or cover crops where you have identified the need to or benefits from using specific varieties?
So maturity class is a big one. So let's take oil radish, for example, because I know a lot of that's used in the States as well. If you use a variety that has an early maturity class, what will happen is it will come out of the ground. So you're planting these things relatively late compared to if you were growing them as a crop to produce seed to harvest, you'd sow them earlier, but you're sowing them quite late. So the plant reacts to lots of different stimulus through the auxins and bits and pieces. So plants react to day length, they react to temperature, all sorts of triggers that they have. If you've got an early maturity class radish, that will grow quite small, and it doesn't have to be very big when it will start to flower and produce seed. Whereas if you have a later maturity class, it'll stay vegetative for longer. So there isn't one answer. So depending on the job you're trying to do, I would say most of the benefits from things like carbon exudates and exudates going into the soil are being delivered when the plant is in a vegetative state. As soon as it goes into a reproductive state, it's actually sending those resources from the roots up into the plant, not out into the soil. So for me, trying to provide the benefits or some of the benefits that cover crops provide, I'm looking for species that stay vegetative for as long as possible. Now, if I'm conversely, if I'm trying to do a job which is to benefit pollinators, I'm trying to produce a mix which flowers for the longest period. So in that situation, I would want some species that had some early flowering species, some medium flowering species, and some late flowering species. So it depends again entirely on the job you want to do. And even with one species, you might want to produce seed. So if we're doing a wild bird mix, having an early maturing radish would be good because it's going to produce that seed for bird food relatively early. But in a cover crop situation, that's unlikely, and we're going to want something which is later maturing that's going to stay vegetative and keep those exudates coming out as long as possible.
I think this is not universally true, but for the majority of producers in North America, the expectation is that a radish will winter kill. And so, in that setting, in that kind, is there a difference in these maturity lengths about how rapidly they grow and develop vegetatively in the fall?
Yeah, I'd say they were, and in my experience, if you've got a smaller plant in a relatively vegetative state in the UK context, so in our climate and our weather pattern, a smaller, more vegetative plant can often be more resistant to a frost than something that's bigger and more developed, because what I find with those bigger plants is the cell walls get burst by the frost, and it can actually damage the plant structure and the plant health much more effectively than those smaller plants with leaves. So you imagine, like, we have winter canola, that we don't want that to get too big going into the winter, otherwise it's more prone to frost damage, for example. So sometimes that's a varietal trait. Sometimes here now we've got a number of farmers here who are actually grazing their winter canola crops, but with sheep at a stage, just a very light grazing. And what that's doing is it's actually chewing off leaves which potentially have some disease pressure on them. And it's bringing the crop down to a smaller stage, and they're actually finding very good results with that. Although again, it's a fairly early stage, but yeah. So that's an example where a bigger plant is actually a disadvantage going into the winter potentially.
So again, if we have the expectation that it is going to winter kill and we want it to winter kill,
Yeah.
are we better off if we want a larger plant so that we have more biomass and more carbon sequestration? We want it to winter kill. Would that be associated with an earlier flowering or a later flowering variety?
Again, that depends a little bit on when you're planting it. So if you were an earlier sowing date, you'd still want a fairly late vegetative one, because it might stay greener for longer and actually produce more biomass from that point of view. Because generally, when things start flowering and seeding, their overall biomass can often not be that much greater. You get more with the vegetative growth. So again, it depends a little bit on the circumstances, but generally, I would say the longer and slower a plant develops, it tends to produce of the same species. So if you were growing something like mustard, something that had later maturity is likely to put on more biomass overall than an early maturing mustard plant would.
Yep.
Same with maize. You know, we see here the reason people plant mazes that have later maturity dates is they have longer to grow in the field and they tend to produce more biomass overall and more yield. The danger is that your harvest date gets to a point where you're actually harvesting in less optimal conditions, and you have problems from that point of view. So there's always a toss up between the two decisions, but that's a general rule of thumb. I would say it was true.
Yeah. So I asked you the question about other specific or other companion plants or cover crops where you have identified the necessity of focusing on specific varieties and varietal differentiation. You spoke about radishes. Are there any others?
Yeah, I mean, again, it really depends on the job you're trying to do. So I'm just trying to think of some sort of examples, but we're very often looking at crops, and because because all the plant breeding has been done to produce yield. Now, whether that's yield of a grain harvest or yield of a forage harvest, it's all about yield and something you can sell or harvest in some way. And quite often we're looking for characteristics that's secondary importance, because we're trying to get some other characteristic. So we things like, I'm trying to think of an example, but we find, okay, give you an example. There are two types of plant which are called buckwheat. There's Phagopyrum esculentum, which is the one people are very familiar with, which has got the black pyramidical shaped seeds. And then there's another one which is Phagopyrum tartaricum, and the seed there generally looks a bit like a small grain of wheat, which is possibly where the name came from, because otherwise the other shaped seed doesn't make a lot of sense. But anyway, but they're both called buckwheat, and they're both used in cover crop seeds over here. Now, the tartaricum type tends to have a smaller 1,000 seed weight. So it tends to give you more plants per unit of weight, effectively. And I'm yet to see a great difference between the size of the plants. A variety that's used very widely in this country is called Lifago, which comes from a breeder in Germany. That is a tartaricum type, and it seems to grow nice and quickly. And the other advantage a seed like that has is that it seems to mix physically when you're trying to put groups of seeds together. The problem is if you mix them and then you put them in the drill, and as you're drilling, the whole thing kind of separates in the drill, which I'm sure you've seen problems with that. The tartaricum one does seem to be more like a rape shape. So if you're mixing the rape seed and the companion crop together, that's helpful. So that's a sort of physical benefit. But when you're doing these things, the most important thing is that you plant your cash crop accurately. So anything that compromises that is to be avoided. So nowadays, a lot of people in this country have drills with more than one hopper. So that metering accuracy can be avoided, or engineered out of the problem. But if you have got to mix everything in one tank, you've got to be very careful of that, because your cash crop's got to be done properly. So that's a physical attribute that's a benefit from compared to one thing to another in our experience. But yeah, it really depends on what you're trying to achieve, and knowing the varieties. And I'll be honest, I'm a complete seed geek. I have no idea why I became so interested in varieties and differences and bits and pieces. And I'll be sat at home on an evening late with my iPad open and earpods in, and my sons will come across and my wife will come across and go, "Oh God, not soil again, not plants again." And it really has become a fascination, because I'm desperately keen to try and do this well, and I'm sure that there's stuff to learn. And sometimes you don't get the right answer because you're asking the wrong question, and it's really, really important that we try and get into this, which is why this kind of open sharing thing is such a wonderful dynamic amongst the regenerative farming literally worldwide.
Yeah, so this has been such a fascinating conversation, but I do want to not lose sight of the nutrition conversation. You mentioned nutrition management as a 1% gain in the context of flea beetle management. What is the degree to which obviously nutrition management has to also be considered when you're incorporating companion plants into these various crops and cover crops and so forth. So how are you approaching that? How are you thinking about that?
An awful lot of the things that we're thinking of have come from you, John, and your team. I mean, as you know, I speak to Kish fairly regularly and follow some of your the very wide, diverse range of speakers that you have on the podcast. And from speaking to you about the role of things like boron and calcium and those sorts of things, we're really reassessing, because I am not an agronomist. I'm a seed guy, but we work quite closely with a number of agronomists from different parts of the country, and we've been challenging ourselves to meet the the potential that you suggested on amounts of things like boron and sulfur and that kind of thing in the mix. So it's an area where we are nowhere near getting that right. And there's been a lot of interest in sap testing, again, probably driven by your information that you've imparted to people. But it was interesting discussing that whole area with you. Is not just the accuracy of the test; it's what you then do with the information the test has given you. So, we were looking at particularly again boron, and I've seen myself with brassica crops, actually mainly kale, where we grow kale as a wildlife crop, but the effect of boron on kale is unbelievable at times. It's just like you've put some magic dust on the stuff. And it's not expensive. It's just not something that in an environmental sense, people look at crop nutrition. So in answer to your question,
Well, when I think about boron and plant response, you mentioned kale, brassicas and cherries are the plants that come to mind that have amongst the highest boron requirements that I know of. So it's no surprise that kale would respond like that.
Yeah. And so in terms of what we're doing with nutrition is we're probably taking a fresh look at it. And I wouldn't say we had anything particularly useful to contribute at this point, but I'm sure that given, as I said earlier, your comments around making plants disease and pest immune by using nutrition, we're seeing more and more evidence of that being the case. And it's like healthy people don't get ill the way unhealthy people do. So I'm quite sure that it's true of plants. We've just never looked at it probably in the detail that we need to. But it's all part of a bigger. So
yeah,
I borrowed an incredibly thick book on soil chemistry from a library in Cambridge, and I'll be honest, I understood about 10% of it. But the thing that kept coming out was soil organic carbon, soil organic matter would make the problem less severe. It kind of buffered it out. So I just came away from reading the first 2 or 3 chapters and thinking, this is a whole rabbit hole that I can't go down. But knowing, okay, we can definitely do something about soil organic matter. And if we do that, it'll make a lot of these problems far less of an issue. So that whole nutrition piece is something that I'm rapidly trying to pick up and learn about.
The aspect that I've been so excited by, really, with the UK growers that I've had conversations with is that it's such a tremendous area of untapped opportunity. Like you've been making significant progress. I'm referring to you specifically with companion planting, and you've been trying lots of innovative things. But many of the growers that I had conversations with, there is tremendous room for innovation and progress with nutrition management, and that's, to me, is quite exciting because it means there's opportunity for significant improvement. There's a lot of easy pieces to pick up.
Yeah, well, that was my main takeaway from the conversations that we had with you around this subject was the genuine excitement that you had because you thought you could make big changes very cheaply and very quickly.
Yeah.
And that came across to me and the other people that were in the conversation. That and I loved it. And I'm probably paraphrasing, but you said something which really made me chuckle and think about it afterwards, which was obviously we're in agriculture and we can't be 100% sure about this, but I'd be in the high 90s. And that was good enough for everybody that was in that conversation, that we thought this there's got to be something here.
Yeah. So Ian, you are a seeds person, and you've mentioned a number of things that are completely new to me in this conversation, and I suspect they're completely new to many people. The idea that there are different maturities of oilseed radish and a second type of buckwheat that, in my in my awareness, I'm only aware of one of those species of buckwheat being here in North America. I could be mistaken about that. but I don't know. And so my question is for people who listen to this conversation and who want to learn more about uh, different varieties and varietal selection of specific cover crops or companion plants. Um, what resources do you have that you would recommend for people to go to learn more? Where can we dig in and learn more nuance about specific species, specific varieties, and variations, and so forth?
Um, well, the first thing I would say is that people have only started to care about this stuff in the last couple of years.
Yep.
So, so, so the breeders and so on who are producing this stuff have not worried about producing literature about variety A or variety B, because no one was really very interested. And and until very recently, someone would ring up for buckwheat, and frankly, they wouldn't care as long as it was buckwheat. That was fine. They weren't that interested. But more and more people are starting to get interested in this in the same detail that they would choose a wheat variety or a maize variety. They're choosing varieties of specific things to do specific jobs. Now that probably started more in the biofumigation world, so cover crops that we use to kill nematodes and things, and there it's clearly very, very important. Um, but I mean, you're lucky in the States to have people as like Keith Burns and Green Cover Seed. I'm sure they've got a lot of access to some of this information and their trials. I mean, I speak to him not infrequently, and he's a very, very interesting and sensible guy, and he's also a great speaker. I listened to his recent podcast he did with yourself, and I agree with an awful lot of the things he was speaking about on that occasion. But a lot of the breeders, and to be honest, most of the big plant breeding companies, they're not British, they're not French, they're not American. They tend to be multinational. So you've got companies in the States that are owned by European plant breeding companies or multinational. Some of them are owned by multinational chemical companies, which is the way a lot of these breeders have gone. But just try and work back from a variety and try and work out where the origin of it is. Certainly in this country, that's how we do it. Find the breeder. So we've got breeders in Europe like RAGT and Jordan's who are doing some tremendous work on radishes. There's DSV, which is a German company. They've done some really good stuff and got a lot of work. Sarton Union is another one, or Peterson. There are other European breeders that produce a lot of information about different varieties and different traits. So there is information out there, but again, just be careful that you know what job you're trying to do and the characteristic that will help you to achieve that, because that's part of the puzzle. Is being clear about the objective, because you'll never know if you've arrived somewhere if you don't know where you're trying to go.
One of the pieces that I'm really intrigued by our conversation is, as I've been learning about various companion plants, we've had this indoctrination for a long time that plants necessarily compete with each other. And what we're discovering is that actually, if you get it right, if you get the right plants growing together, they complement each other and they synergize with each other instead of competing with each other.
Mm.
And when I think about the experiences that you're having and with these companion plants with wheat, I immediately begin thinking about, okay, how can we adapt this information to dryland wheat production? Because here in North America, we have a great deal of wheat production that is in a very different environment from yours, much lower rainfall, much more dryland environment. But I'm of the persuasion that if we get it right, that we can identify varieties and species that don't compete with the wheat for moisture. And I love the alfalfa example from Frederick Larson's work, because we know it has such a different root system that it can actually tap into moisture down deep and bring it up. I suspect if we get it right, it can supply moisture to the wheat instead of competing.
100%. I'm sure that is the potential, whether lucerne is the thing to do that or not, I don't know, but the potential for something like that is there. And actually, I remembered, funnily enough, we just spoke about Keith, but he mentioned the the sorghum crop that he saw in a multi-species thing, and Christine Jones told me about that. And you know, even after all the time that's passed between when she saw it and when she was talking to me about it, it still blew her away, the difference of a multi-species crop compared to all of the individual things planted next to each other that all died, but together they lived together. So, and again, it goes back to something Keith said in your podcast, that the most competition will come from a field full of one thing, because it's all competing for exactly the same things at the same time. That's the biggest competition you'll ever see. And it's finding those complementary partners that are delivering services to one another. And I'm not suggesting for 1 minute it's an easy thing to do, but I think certainly in the forage example, when you look back to what the Great Plains had, when they had 160, 250 different species in there. There's a reason for that. You look at a rainforest, how many species are in a rainforest, and how well that grows without anybody applying nitrogen to it. There is a reason that nature works that way, and we need to understand how we can access those benefits without compromising. Because I don't know what it's like in the States, but there's definitely, there are some really evangelical people in Europe, particularly, and the UK, that they seem to want to make agriculture less productive, and that doesn't work if all that means is you need to farm more land to produce the same amount of output. That's not a solution to me. I mean, I definitely think we should be producing more food and less feed. The whole system of producing food and that actually feeds people. I support that completely, but the idea that you can just simply make agriculture less productive per hectare, it doesn't make any sense. And I know that's not what you're trying to do at AEA. You don't accept that to go regenerative, you need to go backwards on yield or backwards on profit. That's not your experience, and that's a fantastic position to start from, because that seems to be what people think here, that you will go backwards first. And yes, you will, absolutely, if you do it badly. But hopefully, as more and more people are learning how to do these things properly,
that's the key phrase. If you do it badly.
well, but you see that all the time, and there are definitely actors in this space who want to spread this fear because it suits them to keep the status quo. They have very, very big businesses and everything which rely on the status quo, and and actually spreading fear about something which appears to be, and you've done it for years, that should be the way. It's a very easy tool to just lever people into fear. Creates inactivity and no change. So it's taking that fear away. It's scaffolding the farmer with financial confidence. So things, say in England, you've got the sustainable farming incentive, which is scaffolding people financially to make some of these changes and try them. My concern is that the money is there, and if people don't understand the benefit that they are trying to deliver for themselves, they will think that the benefit is only the difference between what they're being paid and what it's costing them to do it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that makes sense. Rather than the benefit of the technique that the incentive is to get you to try, if you try and minimize the cost of trying, you will also minimize the chance of you getting a result that delivers some benefit. So take cover crops, for example. If you only put a really minimum necessary, cheap as chips kind of mix in, it probably won't do that much. Whereas if you just invested a little bit more and were careful about what you chose and took a bit of time to think about what you're doing, that money is in making sure that it hasn't really cost you that much, but you've got a chance of seeing some other benefits like nutrient delivery, whatever that might be.
This comes back to the comment that you made at the beginning of our conversation is, let's be careful about what we incentivize. Be sure to incentivize what you really want.
Precisely. And there's a big move here to simplify the system for people to apply, and I get that completely. I use the expression "get people on the bus." Right, you've got to get people on the bus to get them to go on a journey to do whatever. But equally, there has to be enough checks and balances and quality thresholds that what you're really trying to achieve and paying public money for is actually being delivered. So the amount of something being done is important, but it's nowhere near as important as the quality of what's being done.
So, Ian, I have one last question for you. This has been a fascinating conversation. You're, in my mind, rapidly becoming a gentleman of original perspectives. And with your perspective as historically as a seed breeder and as a seeds person, how should we be thinking about growing our own seed on farm, whether that be of our cash crops or of our cover crops and so forth? What are the benefits and the merits of that from your perspective?
You have to think about the costs of doing that with the amount of the seed that you're trying to produce for yourself. So clearly, I sell seed for a living. That's what I do. So I want people to be buying seed, but equally, I also want people to be getting really good value for money. So what I do in the UK is I encourage people to grow the seed of crops they're more familiar with and they're more set up to grow. So, and also things they need in larger quantities. So, for example, in a cover crop mix, you might use some oats, some peas, some beans, some linseed, something like that. But you might also use some Phacelia and some radishes or something to grow. To take radish for an example, or Phacelia, you probably only want 1 or 2 kilos of that per hectare. So unless you're a very, very large farming business, you're probably only going to need 100 or 200 kilos of seed to use in all of your mixtures. So to take the chance of growing that for yourself is, by the time you've done it and sorted it out, and it's really not worth the hassle. But certainly growing your own oats or your own linseed, where you might want a few tons of those for the area, that makes complete sense. But I think what you're alluding to is this whole thing around the seed carrying the microbial information from the soil it's grown in. And that is an area where, largely information I've heard on your podcast has really got my interest, and I understand the concept. But frankly, from my work on farms in the UK and visiting other parts of the world, our soils are so dead generally that actually we've got far more fundamental basic things to worry about than going there yet. Because actually we need to get this car off the line and start moving forward before we worry too much about that detail. But absolutely, some of my customers are 10 years down this journey, and they are totally growing quantities of their own seed on their own soils. But would that typically be useful? Probably not yet, but it's a very, very interesting topic.
Well, Ian, this has been a fascinating conversation. I've enjoyed it greatly, and I'm certain that our listeners will too. I want to say thank you for being here, for being willing to share your experiences and your wisdom. And I look forward to having a lot more conversations with you in the future.
Yeah, likewise, and thank you and all of your previous guests for the knowledge that they've given me, and certainly a lot of my my friends and colleagues and customers, because I know a lot of people hang on every word of this podcast. So please keep up the good work.
All right. Thanks, Ian.
The team at AEA and I are dedicated to bringing this show to you because we believe that knowledge and information is the foundation of successful regenerative systems. At AEA, we believe that growing better quality food and making more money from your crops is possible. And since 2006, we've worked with leading professional growers to help them do just that. At AEA, we don't guess, we test, we analyze, and we provide recommendations based on scientific data, knowledge, and experience. We've developed products that are uniquely positioned to help growers make more money with regenerative agriculture. If you are a professional grower who believes in testing instead of guessing, someone who believes in a better, more regenerative way to grow, visit advancingecoag.com and contact us to see if AEA is right for you. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to working with you.